Hi everyone! Welcome back to part 2 of this series on ChatGPT for software developers. In this video, I will go over using ChatGPT and writing prompts for code generation, debugging using various examples, also explaining code and project structures, then talk about reformatting and doing some conversions, and then finally about writing tests for code. So let's dive in and talk about some examples of code generation and how we can optimize it and use it to really speed up the development process. As you probably already know, ChatGPT can be used for generating code for new feature development, but there are some things to keep in mind. Just a few things that I've noticed. One thing is that ChatGPT seems to know a lot about languages, especially popular languages, and standard or core libraries for those languages. For example, Python or JavaScript and the Python standard library or popular frameworks. But if you ask it about less popular libraries or certain integrations, for example, the LinkedIn integration, it doesn't do as well and can sometimes give you code that doesn't make any sense at all. You also have to be very specific with versioning. A lot of times I get out of date code. For example, I'll get Vue 2 instead of Vue 3 code, or Vue written with the options API when I want the composition API. So I have to be very specific. And also sometimes when I have a hard technical challenge, it's able to point me in the right direction and give me some ideas, but it doesn't always do very well at solving the actual problem, and sometimes just leads me in circles, just giving me common answers for similar problems that really have nothing to do with what I'm trying to solve. Of course, as you use it, you're going to notice and get a feel for what it's best at and where it's going to be faster to just look at the documentation or try to figure it out without AI. So I want to go through an example here now. This is an example of a feature for this open source app that I built called the Curriculum app. And basically it lets you create or update your own curricula of learning materials sourced from various places and keep track of your progress as you go. And you can also view any other user's curricula. So one feature I've been wanting to add for a long time is a feature where users will be able to fork or clone the curricula from other users and then update them themselves. Right now they can only view. So I wrote out a brief description about this feature and what it's supposed to do. So now I'm going to break this down in a way that AI will be able to understand and also give me exactly what I want. Sometimes what I want and what I'm asking for are not the same thing. I think a good example is, sometimes when you tell someone something and you think it's very, very clear, but then you realize they completely misunderstood what you said. Well, ChatGPT is like that all the time if you don't provide enough context or clear instructions. Also, when you ask it for bigger coding problems, then the code turns out much better if you break it up into multiple steps and then prompt it for each step one at a time. So one prompt and then the next prompt, etc. So let's break this up. So this is a full stack application, right? Here's the code for it. I have the back end and the front end. So I'm going to break this up into 2 steps, or at least 2 steps. First, I'm going to ask it for the back end. So I'm going to say create an API for a feature where users will be able to fork or clone a curriculum. I think the second sentence is good. Upon forking, a copy of the selected curriculum will be created in the user's account. So I'm going to leave it at that, take off the extra words here. I just want the copy to be made, an API for the copy. Now, if I just gave it this prompt, who knows what it would return, because I haven't given it any context for my application. So I'm going to add some context here. I'm building, or I guess I've already built. So let me say, I already have this application built and I want to add a new feature. I'm going to put a list of the technologies here, which for this app is JavaScript, and actually it's full stack JavaScript with Express on the back end and Vue. And actually right now I'm using Vue version 2. So let me say Vue on the front end. And I can actually get the versions of these. If I go to the back end, I can say I'm using Express 4.17. Now I want it to create an API for me, and especially with kind of micro frameworks like Express or Flask, everybody might set it up a little bit differently. So I can actually add some additional examples here. And this is called shot prompting. So if I give it one example, I can call it one-shot prompting 2, then I'd call it two-shot prompting, etc. So I'm going to say, here is an example of one of my endpoint files. So it knows my style of writing the API. So I'll come here and find an API file, and I'll give it the curricula one because that is probably relevant to what it is doing. I don't need to give it all of this, obviously, because it's very long. So let me just give it, well, I think I can, because this isn't that much context. For the newer models, 269 lines. I could probably pare it down a little, but I'll just paste the whole thing. And before this, because I'm asking it to fork a curricula, I could actually provide it with the model as well. That might be helpful for it to know. So I can say, here is the model. And by the way, if you didn't watch my last video, I think it's important to point out, if this is some kind of proprietary company information, then it might be better, depending on your situation, you might want to check temporary chat. So then the model won't be trained on this information and it won't be stored in history. It's just a little bit more secure than just typing it straight into a prompt. So let me find the model here. To go into database, and I can look here. And this is the model. So I'm just going to copy this. There we go. All right, let's see what it gives me. Okay, I've noticed with GPT 4.0 that the instructions are a little bit better, that it basically usually prints out the steps that it understood, and also it should give me, well, sometimes it gives me an overview of the steps that it took and what it changed in a file. So I think it is pretty helpful, but you can ask it not to give you anything extra and just write specifically the code for you. So here it gave me a new route. It's giving me the ID of a curricula, and of course it understood that they need to be authenticated in order to fork, or there would be no user. So here's the actual creation of the forked curricula. It's actually pretty simple, and then it just awaits the save and sends a status back. Let me actually see if that is how I have it here, because I haven't worked on this really in a while. So here's another post request. Here I'm adding a section. Okay, check if authorized, and then I push that, and then I do doc.save. So, okay, so that matches up with what is here. But I think, let me actually see what it's like to create a brand new one. So if I go here, this is post to create a new one. Okay, yeah, I'll do curriculum.save. So that makes sense. Perfect, that actually looks really good. And let's see what else it gave me. I did end up writing a little bit for the front end, but just the method to interact with the back end. And then it even gave me a basic button that I could put in the front end. But I haven't asked it for the front end yet. So I would probably copy paste this into my application, try it out, and then have to iterate on it a little bit. I will ask it some more specifics for the front end now. So now if I go to the front end, I think if I open the file, let's see, the display curricula, this is the list view. And here I would need to add a button. Okay, that's the dialog. I'm using Viewtify here. So if I wanted to create a new curricula, actually it wouldn't be, because the list page is where I just look at the list of them or create a new one. But to fork it, I actually have to come to an individual curriculum. So let's look at an individual one. And I have the different sections, add section, save section. Okay, so in the header here, let me see if I can click. Nope. That is a custom component that I have. So let me go to header.view. So I can edit the header. That's okay. Okay, so that's where the actual text for the title is. And then I have the different sections. So I basically need to ask it to show a button that says fork if it's not a curriculum that I own. So can edit here is actually, it's been so long since I wrote in this style of view. So can edit here is actually coming from the parent component. Let me search for can edit. It's basically checking if it's created by the current user who's viewing it. Okay, so I can use can edit to be able to display the fork button. So as context, I think it would be helpful to feed this component into ChatGPT and also the can edit button, or sorry, the function. So let me feed that in. Okay, wait. Okay, so I need the front end written for that API. Remember that it's view 2, which automatically means it's the options API. And I'll say with Viewtify 2. And I'll say give me a button that only shows up if the curriculum belongs to another user. Let's say give me a fork button. And I'll just write this, it'll probably give it to me anyway, but also give me the logic for forking. And here I'm going to give it the can edit function, and I'll also give it the component that I just copied. So without any other details here, it should be able to tell that that is the component, but I could just say here, this is the view component to update. Please show me exactly which lines are changed. And then I can also tell it, please use this function from the parent. And it should know that this is what's checking if it's created by them, because the variables are very obvious. Okay, let me leave it at that and see what it gives me. Okay, so here's the fork button that it gave me. It gave me a bunch of code. Let me zoom out a little bit. So you can see it printed out the entire component. Sometimes I just ask it for the specific piece of code. And then in the child here, I could add this to the parent, but I just asked it for the function in general. So here's the fork curriculum. So this will call the API. I also didn't tell it how I'm interacting, that I'm using Vuex. So it's just assuming that I've injected Axios, so I have access to it. And then good, it gives me a token. It's just making an assumption also about the token here. If I don't tell it specifically, it usually just assumes the most common or most likely way. Okay, so it added a few things and it gave me the changes summary. I'm not sure exactly why it needed this. The current user, let's see. Okay, if not, can edit. So I'm not sure where it's using the user. Maybe in the request? No. This might just be a phantom variable that it added. Sometimes it adds something and then it doesn't use it anywhere. So I think this one and this one are good. And then now I can tell it I am using Vuex for state management. Please rewrite just the script part to call Vuex. And then I could give it an example of my store here. When I'm writing a script or something basic or small, I don't need to give it any examples. But when I'm writing from an existing application or new feature work, it definitely helps to give it a new example, or it won't fit in with the coding style that already exists in the application. So here are my stores. Let's see, there's my Axios config. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. In Vuex, unlike Pina, it wasn't multiple stores, it was modules inside the store. So let's see, actions. So I can just give it a sampling of at least one post request. Yeah, let me just give it some things here and see how it goes. So here are some examples of actions in my Vuex. Okay, and see how I just asked it for just the script section, just the script part. So otherwise it would rewrite the entire template too. And it will rewrite usually every single thing every single time, unless you just ask it to print out exactly what you want. Okay, so now it gives me a new action that I can use, and the commit, which is the mutation. In Vuex we had to use mutations, and then it also gives me the mutation and the state that I need. Now, one interesting question that I just thought about is I didn't provide it for any information about what to do once it forks. So I'm going to just add that information and see what it does. So once a user forks a curriculum, the application should route them to the newly created curriculum that they own. I'm not going to give it any more information and see what parts it updates. Okay, so now it updated set new curriculum. Okay, it's telling me to modify the for curriculum action. Okay, and now it awaits. Oh, maybe it added async. No, it should have already been there if it was making an API call. Anyway, so now it's doing router.push, okay, and the template remains the same. And so really the only thing of note that it added is this. I think what it should have added, well, it did correctly set the ID in params, which is good. And presumably actually when it routes to that new page, it will pull in the curriculum information and probably set it in the state. So the current, let's see, curricula, selected curriculum, it needs to set it as this, which I guess if it sets as this before it routes, then it might mess up the current page. So if it routes and then pulls, it will load the page again and then, or this component, and in the lifecycle hook, it will populate the selected curriculum object here. So I think if I was really doing this and putting it in the application as I went, there would definitely be some more iteration that I would need. And also planning how to handle that data there. But you can see how helpful it is, even just giving you a starting point for coding instead of having to type every single thing from scratch. And this is kind of the process that I use, breaking it down so it gives me the highest quality code that relates to what I want to build. Another thing ChatGPT is very good for is writing scripts and config files. Things like code for deployments, batch processing jobs, and any kind of configuration files that you need for testing or your application. I'm going to give one example here. So I want a script that can run on a cron to notify users 1 week before their account expires. Just to give it some context, I need this written in Python using the serverless framework for deployment on AWS. I could also give it some information about how to connect to my database, what my user's model looks like. I might actually put that one here. So user, I'll just give it the most basic one and an expires at field. And let's see what it writes. You can see it gave me the exact steps. First, it's not making any assumptions, so it tells me to install serverless, make sure I have it installed. And then of course, serverless is an extremely popular framework, so it knows the API well. It's telling me how to create this new serverless function. And then it gives me the actual function file. It creates some sample users since I didn't tell it about my database. It just assumed I'm using simple notification service from AWS for sending out notifications. And then it tries the notification, it prints out some logging and debugging information, and then returns. And then it also lets me know how to write the config file for serverless to manage the handler that it just wrote. And then of course how to deploy. Now I could ask it to update that. So I can say that's good. Now can you update that function to work with, so you can see it added the resource for Dynamo in the serverless YAML configuration file. It knew to do that without me asking for it. And then it says step 2, update the handler function. So now it's going to update to be able to integrate with Dynamo. The code looks good, just giving it a quick overview. And it seems to give me all of the steps that I want. It also gives me this optional step to populate the DynamoDB table if I want a script to be able to populate it. It's also very good at explaining the steps for doing something. Let's say I didn't know how to set up SNS. I could ask it, can you give me the steps to set up SNS, or simple notification service on AWS, to integrate with this script and show me how to use it to send emails. So it gives me the steps for setting up SNS and then using it for email, because you can do different types of notifications. And then it also showed me, because it still remembers the context of what I asked it before, because now it has a very large context window. It remembers that I need to update my serverless YAML, and then it also updates the handler file, and yeah, just reminds me to redeploy. And again, here's the summary of what it did. Very helpful, especially if there's a lot of code to dig through. And I could do the same thing for any type of job. A common type of job is to clean up deleted objects. I could, of course, add some context about which objects. Since I've only talked about one table here, I'll just use the previous context. Deleted user objects. There is a field called is deleted on the user. use all of the previously mentioned technologies. And you can see it remembers, okay, I need to use Dynamo, the serverless framework, and using Python. Of course, I didn't tell it the version, but I think this might be the latest version that's available on AWS. I'd have to check. Okay, so it kept my old function notify users, and it's telling me to put this in the same file, which I guess that's fine. Clean up users. So it looks for deleted users. And by the way, when I used to work in consulting and we had to do a bunch of Dynamo work, it seemed like every single time we had to write new code for this, we had to look up how to do it because the DynamoDB API is notoriously hard to use. So it's very, very nice that ChatGPT is well versed in things like this. Those are just some examples. It's also very, very good at writing GitHub actions and other types of deployment code. It's great at writing Docker files. So if I come back to this previous example here, I can ask it now create Docker files for the front and back ends. And actually I should specify one Docker file for each of the front and the back end. And it wrote both Docker files, and of course I can give it specific instructions about the network or specific technologies, etc. One thing I like to do, and I've already done it in my context, but it keeps forgetting for some reason, is I want to tell it to please don't include any comments in the code. That way I can easily just copy and paste it because I don't need an explanation of what it's doing since I already know. And I also want it to create a Docker Compose file so it can spin up both of them at the same time. And let's see what it does. So it took all of the comments out of the code like I requested, and it's giving me the Docker Compose file that will run the back end, the front end, and also spin up a Postgres container just as I asked it to. And here, this is kind of nice, it's just reminding me that this is the assumption that it's making about the directory structure of my project. Now I could come here, since it accepts images, I could come here and basically take a screenshot of it. So let me zoom out a little bit so I can take the whole screenshot. I don't want to include the Jenkins file, so maybe I'll stop there. And now I'm going to give it this screenshot and say this is my directory structure. It seems to be very good at reading directory structures in screenshots. So now it's updating the Docker Compose file to curriculum front, curriculum back, exactly what I showed in the screenshot. And it didn't give me a list, so I can actually ask it, can you give me a list of what you just updated there? And so it's showing me exactly what changed. I use this for pretty much all of my configuration files, at least as a starting point, whether it's PyTest, GitHub Actions, even git ignore. I have some prompts saved so I can just generate these types of config files that I want. It really speeds up my work in some of these small scripts that I need to write, maybe up to 5 to 10 times as quickly as I would without AI. I want to give a few more examples of some things that I use ChatGPT for all the time. One of them is SQL. It seems to be very, very good at writing SQL queries with subqueries and other complexities, as well as converting between SQL and popular ORM code. So I'm going to give it a question here. I'm going to say write the SQL to query and get the count for how many activities a user has per category. Now, of course, you don't know what I'm talking about yet, so let me paste in the context here. And these are just some tables that I have written for SQL Alchemy in a basic application that I made. And so I have users, I have accounts. This is kind of a personal budgeting application. So users have accounts and they can have categories for how they spend their money. And then also activities, which includes income, expenses, and transfers. So I'm asking it to give me the SQL query to get the count for how many activities I need to say a user has per category. So let me see what it gives me. And so fast, it gave me a query with the proper joining and also group by. And of course, I can keep asking it questions in the same context. Now, tell me the total income per category for a user. Of course, I told it for a user, so it's saying users.id as user ID, but it's not denoting a specific user here because I think the way I worded my last question is kind of nebulous. It just says a user has per category. So actually, before I do this next one, can you update that to make it only for a user with ID 2? So now it added this where clause to only apply to the user with ID 2. And now if I go back and now tell me the total income per category, I'm going to say for that user. So I think you get the idea. It's generally very good at producing SQL. And now if I want to convert this, I can say, can you give me that in SQL Alchemy? And specifically, I'm going to say 2.0 because most of the code online that it's probably been trained with is on 1.x, which was around for a long time. 2.0 is newer. So I'm going to see what it gives me. And you can see it does give you all the setup code every time by default, which usually I ask it to not give me that, just give me the query itself. This seems pretty good. If you have specific session variables, then you can just tell it what to use there. But overall, this actually looks like it might work. And now, because it will remember the context from the first prompt that I gave it, if I go down here, I can say, can you write pedantic schemas for me for all of those models? Please include schemas for creating, updating, displaying single objects and items as a list. So let's see what it gives me. And it did give me, I was a little confused at first about raw password, but I remember I just put that field for the tutorial purposes. It's not an actual field that I would have in a database. So this all seems to make sense. When I used to work on fast API applications, I used to think, wow, there's a lot of typing and boilerplate between files, but now it's really nice that once I have it in one format, then I can just easily convert it to another format for whatever I need it to do from ChatGPT. And one more thing that I want to do is I want to show you a screenshot. Let me actually start a new chat since it already has all of my context here. So I'm going to take a screenshot of a table, and I can also do a screenshot of an ERD diagram with multiple tables, but here I'm just going to use a screenshot of one table, and this is actually the activities table that you saw in the last example. It has two foreign keys, right? The user ID and also the category ID. So let me just ask it, can you give me SQL Alchemy model, let me do SQL Alchemy 2.0 model classes for this table and any related tables. Let me see what it gives me. Here, because I give it a screenshot, it's just confirming that it read the screenshot correctly here with the columns. And then it gives me user category. It's just assuming with the minimum amount of fields here because all it sees is a foreign key. So user category, and then it's calling it a transaction because I didn't tell it the name of the table, but it's just assuming here, which is nice. It's also great at explaining things. So if there's code in an application that I'm working on, or if code that it gives me is something I don't understand, for example, in SQL Alchemy 2.0, you commonly use the .scalars method. So I can just ask it for SQL Alchemy, why do I need to use the scalars here? So the code is async and then the function definition here. And let me just put this on a new line so it's more apparent. And then this also goes on a new line. And this got all jumbled up in my copy paste. And then I can ask it, why not just .all? And also, can you give me some examples of data to illustrate this? So sometimes if I just ask it the question, why do I need to use scalars? It's not always apparent. Well, let me just show you without this last comment so you can see. So it's explaining why I would use the scalars method, and it breaks down the steps. It explains pretty nicely, but it didn't give me any real examples. So I think it's more clear sometimes when you can see an example. So I can say, give me some examples using data to illustrate this. So it's very, very clear, right? It shows me in table form and the code example if I used it without scalars. And then it also gave me the example, what it looks like if I use it with scalar. Yeah, it gave quite a few examples here. And you can just keep diving into asking it questions forever about the code. For example, if I want to ask it about this, because you see all the examples it gave you, there's only one element in this tuple. So why does it wrap it in a tuple if there's just one element? So I can ask it, can you give me some examples where there are, or let's say there would be more than one element in this tuple from the without scalars example. So now it's explaining that to me. When a query selects multiple columns or joins multiple tables, the result tuples can contain more than one element. So now it's giving me an example where I select multiple columns and then the tuples come out with, of course, the value for each column in every tuple. It's also giving me the example of joining multiple tables. It shows the resulting data printed out from joining tables, which is basically because I'm also selecting one column from one table and one column from another table. So in that case, of course, I wouldn't flatten it with a scalar. And I think you can see how incredibly useful this can be. One other thing that you can do with the code writing features is that you can take different screenshots of especially UI elements, or if there's some kind of interface, even if it's in the terminal, and get it to write the code that you would need to create that thing. So for example, here is an example of being able to select different chips. This is something I was doing recently. So I am actually going to take a screenshot of this and then put it in. I'm actually going to open up a new chat and I'm going to add that screenshot. I'm going to take a screenshot and I'm going to ask it to create this feature for, or I should say create a feature using chip groups that looks like this for user onboarding in a Vue 3 application. The UI component, it'll probably give me something custom or maybe use Bootstrap, but I'm just going to ask it to do it specifically in Vuetify. So UI component library is Vuetify, and that's version 3. And it did give me chip groups. That works. And I was thinking it was going to change these for user onboarding, but then I realized those are actually labels like amenities, neighborhoods. That might actually be something I would want depending on the type of application, since I didn't give it any additional context. And here sometimes it will give me the options API still, but I think maybe I've asked it enough times to give me script setup that it just does that for me by default, or maybe it updated, so that's good. Just for fun, let me ask it, can you run this example for me? Are you able to run code in Vue components? Of course, I think the answer is no, because it would have to install Vue and Vuetify, etc. So yeah, it says I can't run Vue components directly. At some point it probably will be, but for right now it seems to just run basic scripts like JavaScript and Python without additional libraries. Okay, so it gave me steps, that's fine. I want to close it off here with something funny. There's various funny things that you will run into over time with ChatGPT, and one of them is when it tries to generate ASCII art. So I'm going to ask it, for example, to generate my name in ASCII art. Can you write Gwen in ASCII art? Let's see what it gives me. Yes, Gwen. Let's see. Greade. Let's see. Are you sure that is correct? Here's an updated one. Let's see what it gives me. Now it's Greard. So eventually I kept doing this the other day for fun, and it ended up just giving me one letter every single time. Obviously, this is not an important feature because there are plenty of websites that will generate all types of ASCII art for you. But it is kind of funny because it only ever seems to be able to generate the first character correctly, and everything else seems a little random. That was just a fun example to close it off. In the next video, I'm going to talk about more topics for using ChatGPT for learning. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback for me, I'd love to hear from you. Please leave it in the comments below. You can also join my Discord, which is linked in the description below this video. I hope you have a great week. Happy coding, and I'll see you in the next video.